Imagine a warm kitchen where iron kettles breathe and a grease-smudged ledger waits by a tallow candle. For 5 months, the bell over the yard has marked meals and punishments with the same steady tongue. Then, a child's laughter goes silent, and the ledger begins to carry ash. This is the forensic story of Dinah May, Alabama Territory, in the year 1811. Before we dive in, please subscribe if you value slow, original investigations like this one. In modern days, the path back to that night began inside the Alabama Department of Archives and History in Montgomery. On the 20th day of October, 2014, a staff historian processed a newly declassified packet from a defunct county office, court minutes, sheriff returns, and plantation memoranda compiled during a territorial inquiry. At the center lay a single leaf torn from a household ledger, its edges singed, its columns beaded with a pale drop of wax like a hard tear. In the margin, beside a list of male guests and resident overseers, a hand had pressed a row of crosses, equal in number to the men recorded that week. Below the crosses, in a different ink, someone wrote a single word that the clerks could not agree upon either reckoning or recovery. The archivist flagged the leaf for conservation, and the packet's contents, once laid side by side, sketched the outline of a massacre that local memory had washed away. The site, called Dogwood Bend, sat on a curve of the Tombigby's brown water, a cotton place sown with corn and hogs, ringed by swamp breaks and watched by dogs. A broad drive separated the big house from the gin yard, where a tall frame and creaking paddles worked fiber through iron teeth. To one side, a storehouse stacked with salt, ironware, and tobacco breathed its cold into the yard even in summer. The kitchen, detached to contain heat and hazard, faced a fig tree that threw shade across a low window. A bell hung from a frame near the wash kettles. Its tongue met iron at dawn, noon, and night, and at any hour when a white hand wished to summon or warn. Keys lived on a ring at the mistress's waist by day and on a hook in the pantry by night, except on account-settling evenings when men took them up along with bottles. Routines at Dogwood Bend were surveillance made into calendar. Hands filed from cabins to the quarters square at first bell. Drivers counted lines. A tallyman set chalk on a board at the gin. The overseer rode the perimeters with a short whip coiled on his saddle horn like a small sleeping snake. Dogs patrolled the gaps between fences and swamp. The master counted bales and promises by his ledger, believed paper could command fields, and trusted that fear, hunger, and cold made a wall higher than brick. Dinah May lived within this wall and learned its angles. She had been brought inland through Mobile years earlier, moved in a wagon with other women lashed to a beam. Records gave her no age, only a roll entry that paired her name with the kitchen. In the kitchen, she rose from scullion to cook, made cornbread that cracked clean under the heel of a palm, and stewed meat with blackstrap and spice that the mistress's guests praised as house pride in their letters. She kept a private ritual of order, blades sharpened before dawn, hearth swept by the same strokes each night, tins stacked tallest to smallest on the shelf nearest the window. She knew lies bite, and the measure of saltpeter for curing, the way scalding water could loosen fat into fire, and how an ember, hidden in ash, could wait like a thought no one had yet spoken aloud. Her son, named Jonah by the quarters, and never recorded in the ledger's people columns, was a small runner between cabins and kitchen. He fetched, he watched, he learned the paths no white eye attended. On a late summer evening, with the yard loud from a card game in the office, and 2 neighbors visiting for the tally of bales to come, the men looked for sport the way men of power sometimes do when heat hangs and drink makes more space for cruelty. They turned fun into a dare at the millpond, and Jonah was made the token. The water did its simple, brutal work. The archive packet never set down the words of that act. It hinted with euphemisms, wrote about an accident and rough merriment, but the next day the quarters dug a small grave near the fig tree, and the kitchen hearth took on a silence that the bell could not fill. Grief moved in Dinah like a river after rain, soundless, brown, steady, and aimed. She stopped humming over dough. She sharpened her knives to an edge as fine as thread. She handled lye with care, then with study, then with intent. She watched the dogs when the night watch changed and learned which cries were for coons at the compost and which marked a man crossing from yard to quarters. She found the pantry hook where the keyring slept and learned its swaying rhythm when a door closed too hard on the other side. She traced, under the shelf, a seam in the floorboard that flexed under weight, a place where a small wedge could tilt a dropped key out of sight. The system had many masters, and each believed himself the only one. There was Ephraim Barrow, planter and owner, whose vice was debt, and whose method of control was paper promissory notes, chattel bills, tallies, all bound in ribbon and hidden in the desk where he kept a pistol that rusted from disuse. He thought a signature was stronger than iron, and his weakness was the vanity that came with being treated as a gentleman by men who measured him with the same ledger he loved. There was Cage Nolan, overseer, whose power was motion. He rode before dawn, rode at noon, rode at night, and liked to be seen in motion because it let him imagine he was everywhere at once. His vice was the whip and the speed it seemed to give him over all other bodies. His predictable weakness was certainty that horses and dogs extended his reach without limit. There were the visiting cousins, Silas and Birch Weatherby, small planters whose land suffered from poor soil and who came to Dogwood Bend whenever accounts were due and whiskey was plentiful. They wore town cloth, gambled with the master, and took liberties with the quarters because distance from home made them bold. Their vice was bravado, their weakness was the hunger for proof of it, which drew them into back buildings and shadowed paths where a steady hand could set a snare. There was Judah Pike, the gin man, whose lungs kept the dust of fiber and who found assurance in machines. He held keys to oil, to grease, to the little store of niter used to dry damp powder in the office. He trusted mechanisms, believed gears could not lie, and thus he missed the small human hands that alter feed, slacken belts, or pack lint into corners where a spark might later find a bed. Lastly, there was the parson lender, Reverend Holcomb, a man who blessed meals and extended credit in the same breath. He counted souls like coins and bales like scriptural proofs. His vice was self-regard. His weakness was the conviction that rules protected him, a belief that made him leave his walking stick and his ring of tiny brass cabinet keys in places where servants could see them. Each paragraph in the archive notes, each receipt and sheriff's line item, made their faces clear enough for history's dull glass. Through them walked Dinah, who kept her ritual and held her grief like a coal wrapped in cloth. She understood the site's physics in her bones, the way heat arcs when grease jumps to fire, how an ember placed into a twist of dry lint can travel like a worm until it reaches a timber seam, how heavy doors, once swollen by humidity, can be coaxed to stick at a chosen moment, how lye, dissolved in water and hidden in the sheen of wash or stew, could be measured to weaken without betraying smell. She did not yet act. She watched. She gathered small things. The seed. Artifacts that would later carry weight entered the record as trivialities. A charred corner of that household ledger, saved by a clerk because it threatened to crumble, preserved the list of guests expected for the autumn settling. A decoy keyring, fashioned from a circle of bent wire and 2 empty tags, appeared in the inventory of the county inquest, like a curiosity recovered from ash near the pantry window. A rusted lock, recorded as taken from the smokehouse door, showed a hairline flaw in its shackle where someone had worried it with a file over many evenings. A fig tree, sketched by an engineer who later mapped the property during a boundary dispute, stood close enough to the kitchen to let a small body reach the sill. None of these items named her. All of them, we now understand, pointed. Community logistics made any plan either possible or fatal. Older women kept eyes on the toddlers and exchanged word in the cadence of work songs. Boys traded routes through cane and swamp. Elders remembered high ground when the river rose. 2 men who could not be seen together by day wrapped scraps of iron in cloth to hide the noise as they pressed a dull file along the smokehouse lock. A girl who fed the dogs learned to keep them calm with meat, set out on the far side of the yard when the bell sounded late. In these small movements, time stretched into a flexible cord. Dinah drew on it cautiously, because a mistake would bring a night of irons and a morning of bodies. The archives contained a sheriff's note about rumors running ahead of facts. The note named a child witness, a phrase that likely meant a girl sent to fetch water who saw footprints in ash, or a boy awake late enough to chart lanterns moving out of sequence. The note mentioned a flaw in the plan that almost ruined it, a bell rope that snapped when pulled in rain so the night watch delayed the second round. The delay forced an adjustment in timing that, later, would funnel men toward the kitchen, at once rather than in pairs. Without that snapped rope, the record suggests, there would not have been so many crosses in the margin of the ledger leaf. Gravity gathered toward the autumn reckoning. Cotton stood stacked in pen after pen. The cousins returned with talk of bails and debts. The parson lender arrived with a little ring of brass keys and a ledger of his own. The overseer bragged about yields. The gin man tuned belts. The master decided to host a late meal after the tally so that men could toast numbers with fat and sugar. Dinah hung kettles, stacked wood, skimmed lard, and set aside a plain pot near the hearth, whose purpose the record never names. She moved like water running in channels cut long before, showing nothing of the shift that had already occurred inside her. When the sun slid low on the chosen day, wind moved out of the swamp and brought with it the thin smell of peat. Dogs grew restless and were fed early by the girl who knew their habits. The pantry keyring left its hook. The decoy ring took its place. The seam in the floorboard met the small wedge she had made from a scrap of oak. The storehouse lock, worried for evenings, came ready to stick if a certain pressure bent its floor home. In the office, the master drew a line under a column and tied a ribbon around his bundle of papers, never imagining how paper burns when hot grease finds a seam. The ticking signal that ends this act appeared then, as routine. The yard bell raised for the night watch. The rope, repaired in haste, held. Its clang rang twice, then thrice, then settled. Men lifted bottles, dogs slept at a distance, the fig leaves barely moved. A cook stood by a window with a plain pot that reflected flame like a small, controlled sundae. The archive notes end that section with a final line written in a clerk's tight hand. From here, events become indivisible. The plan rose from the physics of Dogwood Bend. Heat lived in the kitchen, tension in belts at the gin, pressure in a locked storehouse, pride inside the office ledger. Dinah May shaped those forces until they could move without her voice, until the place itself would push back. She began in the kitchen because fire answers the hand that feeds it. The plain pot near the hearth held rendered lard skimmed over days. Grease filmed the rim like glass. In a second pot, lye lay dissolved in clear water meant for scouring pans. She dipped rag into lye and drew a thin wet line across the stone threshold where the floor met the pantry door, a smear invisible in that light but slick under boots. On the hearth, she placed a twist of dry lint taken from the gin's cleaning, hidden that afternoon under ash to warm without smoke. When she tipped the lard, the first thin spill kissed the embered twist. Grease climbed the heat. Flame reached back. What began as cooking became a controlled boil-over, a sheet of fire that rose and hummed, more light than sound. Men smelled it as celebration. Late meal meant meat, sugar, and spectacle. They gathered in the passage between office and kitchen, drawn by the sight of a cook managing a big blaze with bare forearms and an iron ladle. The decoy keyring hung on the pantry hook where any man might reach without asking. Dinah's real prize, the cabinet keys Holcomb dangled all afternoon, sat deep in her apron fold. When the master motioned toward the pantry for another bottle, the cousin named Birch reached for the hook and came back with wire and emptiness. In the same movement, he stepped across the lye-slick threshold, slipped, and threw his weight into the door. The wedge under the floorboard received that shock and tilted. The seam opened the width of a coin. The real cellar key, dropped there hours earlier, sank out of sight. Across the yard, Judah Pike had returned to the gin to admire his belt adjustments for the evening's display. Earlier, Dinah had asked a boy to carry a pan of hot wash to the lint closet on the pretense of cleaning tools. The boy tipped the pan into a crook behind a beam where dry lint nested. Moist heat crept through the fiber until it felt more like flesh than fluff. Judah's pride was the steady hum of motion, so he tightened the top belt beyond his normal mark to keep that note even. The new tension pulled, and friction met damp lint just as the kitchen's flare cast a brighter wash outside. Heat became ember, ember became hidden worm, and fire began to walk the gin's interior, slow as a thought but more faithful. Cage Nolan's countermove arrived with hooves. He heard the kitchen bellows and assumed drink had drawn men too close to flame. He swung into the yard to show order. His horse, already wet from a pass along the swamp fence, jittered at the smell of grease fire. Dogs lifted their heads and settled again where the girl had fed them heavy. Nolan saw the first lick of smoke rise from the gin frame beyond and thought sabotage or carelessness. He spurred toward it and shouted orders that came out as shapes and gestures, because smoke made words thin. He sent a driver to the storehouse for more lamps and oil. The driver reached the door and found the rusted lock catching just as it had been taught to do. He jerked, The shackle jammed at the floor. In the time it took him to curse a mechanism, a puff of warm wind from the kitchen carried tiny sparks toward the open loft of the store. Dinah moved through these changes as if following marks laid earlier on the floor. She salted the blaze with calm, lifting a lid, lowering it, letting flame lick and fall. She ladled stew into shallow bowls, not poison but heat, meat, fat, floating high, sugar darkened, a meal meant to make men heavy and slow. She positioned the big pot so that each visitor, leaning to taste, put his back to the only easy exit. The decoy keys circulated uselessly from hand to hand. When the master realized the pantry remained locked, he sent Silas Weatherby with orders to fetch the ring from the office desk. Silas pushed into the passage just as Birch staggered up, boot soles wet, pride wounded, face bright with heat. For a moment they bottlenecked, 2 men wide in a 1-man gap. Dinah raised the pot, tipped it to hiss, a warning on the stone, and the pair stepped back together, delaying themselves by accident. At the gin, Judah's certainty fractured. A belt snapped with a sound like a small tree cracking. The upper wheel seized, the teeth clanged empty air. He tried to starve the fire by stopping motion, but momentum and flame had already formed a pact. Lint flared inside where no bucket could reach. Men pushed a barrel toward the door. Sparks blew toward the yard. One found the thatch on the lower eave and wrote an orange line along it as easily as a pen writes on paper. Nolan put his horse between the frame and the quarters to hold a line that could not be held. The animal danced and kicked at sudden light. Its hind shoes struck a water bucket and sent it rolling uselessly. That is how small things decide larger ones. Set piece followed set piece, each solving a problem and making another. In the office, the master gathered papers and the household ledger. He wrapped ribbon around the bundle and tucked it under his arm to preserve a count over life. In doing so, he left the pistol on the desk and trusted in his authority to clear a path. When he met the kitchen doorway, he found bodies and heat. The bundle shielded his chest like a precious book at a chapel door. He turned back toward the porch, and that detour sent him into the path of men running lamps to the storehouse. At the storehouse door, the driver still worked the lock. The floor bit deeper as he shook. A second man brought a lamp too close to see the keyhole. Lamp oil slopped the wood and made a shine that later photographs would read as a ladder of burn. Holcomb arrived carrying his small ring of brass keys, offended that the pantry stood shut, and the storehouse too. He bent to help, using the wrong key in a wrong lock and insisting on the moral of order while physics wrote another lesson. At that moment, the gin loft dropped ember onto the eave of the store. Light lifted from grease to lint to shingle to oil. A low, gusting breath moved from the river, and fire crawled under the roof like a squirrel. The door still would not open. Men crowded the stoop as if proximity could force wood to respect rank. Inside the kitchen, Dinah flipped her pot lid as a signal to the quarter lookout visible through the fig leaves. Women moved children along the ditch that ran behind the cabins to the cane edge. Elders took up quilts and slapped sparks off cabin roofs that the wind pushed toward them. A boy carried a wet burlap and smothered a patch on the wash shed. The girl who fed the dogs kept them calm with bones set far from the path people needed. These acts did not look like revolt. They looked like keeping a world from widening into full burn. The neighbor's arrival nearly ruined the geometry. A small planter from downriver had ridden up late for the toast and expected brightness from lamps, not the kind carried by flame. His mule balked at smoke and pulled sideways into a stack of staves, knocking them across the path Dinah intended to use as a last corridor from kitchen to yard. For a breath, the way out narrowed to nothing. She lifted the plain pot and shifted 2 steps to the left where clay held, and the staves did not roll. The mule's hooves beat rhythm on wood. Sparks leaped. The neighbor, seeing a woman with a pot in a door of fire, took her for part of the emergency that must be managed. He ran toward the storehouse instead of toward her, and in that misreading lay her passage. Cage Nolan tried a countersweep. He called for men to form a line from the pond. In the confusion, no line could find itself. Buckets traveled but spilled. The horse, blind with light, reared and broke the strap that held the small whip coil on the horn. The whip fell and snaked under a boot. Nolan lost balance and grabbed at a porch post wet with oil from a lamp collision. His hand slid. He dropped, caught a knee on the edge of the step, and his leg folded with a soft pop that carried under the blaze noise. He crawled toward the yard wall, reached for the dog pen for support, and found only quiet animals licking bones. His vision slowed to frames. In each, he saw a different source of light and failed to name the one that mattered. The storehouse ceased to be a room and became a lung. It drew air through cracks and fed its own flame. With the door stuck and the upper eave lit, the heat pushed down and then back out at once. The lampmen stumbled from the stoop with hair singed and eyebrows gone to ash. Holcomb dropped his small brass ring. It skittered into the grass, later to be found by a child who passed it up the line to Dinah. Judah Pike attempted one last adjustment at the gin. He reached into a moving part with a rag to choke air from ember. The rag caught, twisted, and pulled his arm hard. He left the rag there and backed away in time for the frame to groan and buckle. The fall trapped him in an angle of beam and ground, more weight than one man could move in that glow. From the office came the master with his ribboned bundle, forced now onto the porch by rising indoor smoke. He looked left at the gin, right at the storehouse, and measured which numbers mattered. He chose to save papers and stepped off the porch toward the drive. Between porch and drive lay the path past the kitchen window. Dinah, holding her pot low, pivoted inside the shadow of the wall. The light at the window showed her to a boy perched on a wheelbarrow, a late watcher set to run messages. The boy's eyes and the clerk's later note made the child witness that survives. He saw a woman pass through flame carrying heat as if it were one more tool. He would later say only that nothing in her face looked surprised. The kitchen became a hinge for the whole site. Men retreated there because it was the only place where someone seemed to have a handle on the blaze. Dinah used that drawer to compress them. A pan left at ankle height tripped one. A bucket under a bench stopped another's backward step. Bodies collected in the doorway, blocking themselves. Smoke curled along the ceiling and then dropped, as it does when a room loads beyond its share. She seized the repaired bell rope by the door and pulled until it snapped again, this time by design. The sudden silence after its break felt like a held breath before a dive. The last countermove came from the wind. A small shift tried to push flame toward the cabins. The elders answered with wet quilts, and the ditch became a moat long enough to matter. The path to the swamp opened where Cain met Gum. A man from the quarters guided a line of children into the cool undergrowth, 2 by 2, hand to shoulder. In that murk, the sound of the plantation diminished to a distant grinding and a rain of ash that felt like coarse powder on skin. The irreversible moment arrived without ceremony. The gin frame, weakened and warmed, tipped. When it fell, a tongue of flame leaped sideways and found the office porch. Paper meets fire fast. The ribboned bundle the master carried drew heat the way a moth draws night. He stumbled and dropped it. Leaves scattered, some blank, some written, all bright. In the same breath, the storehouse roof went from glow to open flame. Timbers cracked. A gust pulled fire through the pantry window into the passage and licked the lye-slick threshold where earlier a man had slipped. What had been a series of adjustments became a single field of change. Dinah stepped back from the window and set the plain pot on the hearthstone. She looked once toward the fig tree where a small grave lay under leaves. She lifted a hidden sack from beneath the lowest shelf coins gathered over seasons, a bone needle, a narrow file, a twist of dried fruit. She pressed the small brass ring from the grass into the sack's mouth. Then she crossed the kitchen and left by the rear, slipping into the sound of quilts slapping sparks and the low call that gathers children to a path. Behind her, fire and smoke drew men inward with the same certainty that had once drawn them to paper and keys. Ahead, Cain brushed her arms cool as water. The night, already committed, closed on the yard with a firm hand. Dawn showed what night had arranged. Smoke lifted in slow ropes from the gin's ribs. The storehouse roof sat like a blackened shell. The office porch leaned and gave a soft creak each time heat sighed from its joists. The neighbor who had arrived late returned with men from his place and found bodies by their tasks and habits, as if the plantation had tried to continue while the air refused. The master lay in the drive just beyond the kitchen window. Papers curled around him like dried leaves. Cage Nolan, the overseer, rested against the dog pen boards with one leg folded underneath in a wrong angle and his hand still reaching for the rail. Judah Pike lay pinned in the angle where the frame met earth, held not by chains but by timber. The cousins, Silas and Birch Weatherby, were tangled near the pantry threshold amid a scatter of bowls and a toppled bench. The parson lender lay on the storehouse stoop with his small brass ring gone, and a smear of lamp oil drying under his sleeve. Other men from the evening's reckoning clerks, a trader, a field driver pressed into house duty, were set about the passage and yard in postures of retreat or advance. A count made on a scrap of blank ledger placed the death toll at 12, all white men who had been in command, or in company, at the hour the bell broke. What survived told the story's order more reliably than any sworn word. On the kitchen threshold, the stone bore a chalky line that felt slick when wetted, the trace a scullery woman recognized as lie. Inside the pantry, the hook showed bright where a ring had been lifted and replaced quickly. A loop of bent wire found in the ash matched the shine, a decoy made to satisfy a hurried hand. Beneath the window shelf, one crack of floorboard gaped a finger's breadth. When a boy slid a knife blade there, metal found empty air. Someone had worked a wedge into that seam to swallow what fell. The gin carried its own ledger of heat. The V pattern on an interior post rose from the lint closet up toward the belt housing, then flattened where motion stopped, and fuel climbed. Melted tallow on a fallen beam showed that flame had reached high before the structure sagged. A rag remained knotted on the spur where Judah had tried to choke air. Threads fused to iron showed heat enough for failure long before the fall. At the storehouse, the burn traced a ladder from stoop to eave, where lamp oil had slopped, then ran under the roof to meet embers blown from the gin. On the office porch, small scorches dotted the planks like a flock of birds, each one the size of a poker chip paper curls that landed, flashed, and vanished. The dogs, unusually, were unmarked and quiet. Grease bones lay near their pen, still damp, their bellies made sense of their stillness. Footprints in soft dirt behind the kitchen ran light and single file toward the ditch and the cane. A child watcher's account, noted later by the sheriff as sober and without embellishment, placed a woman at the kitchen window at the hinge moment, a pot low in her arms, face set in the same work look seen any winter morning. The girl who fed the dogs admitted to giving them heavy meat before the bell's late ring. Elders from the quarters showed wet quilts strung on lines where they had smothered sparks, and a path cut through cane to the swamp break. By mid-morning, the sheriff from the county seat arrived with militia from an upstream post, their coats bleached by sun and their boots passing through ash with soft whispers. He posted men at the ditch, at the river bend, and at the track to the neighbor's place. The inquiry began that afternoon in the office, room cleared of heat enough to stand. Procedures followed forms kept for barn fires and drownings, and adjusted here with new caution. A list of the dead was set down by hand with the introduction, accidental fire under circumstance of servile disorder. The choice of words mattered. Accident to satisfy insurance, disorder to satisfy fear. Neighbors gave statements in a measured circle. The parson's deacon recalled the decoy keys with confusion. The neighbor remembered the mule's balk and the fallen staves. The gin hand described the snapped belt. A driver talked about a lock that would not yield. The cook's name surfaced and resurfaced, Dinah May, not as an accusation uttered in anger, but as a fact carried by the pattern of evidence. Her absence carried more weight than anyone's presence. A coroner's jury convened the next day in a log room at the county house, the long table marked by candle stubs and a single ink pot that left black tears along the page margins. The ledger charred leaf recovered from the kitchen desk was produced by the master's cousin, who had gathered papers from the yard when wind permitted. The crosses in the margin drew attention. The jurors debated whether the marks were tallies of guests or an accounting made after the fact. The clerk wrote both readings into the minute book in case the territorial governor's office wished to cite one or the other. The bell rope, broken fresh, was examined and declared new hemp, sound before rupture. The decoy ring was placed with the lock and the rag as implements of confusion. Search parties went to the swamp line with dogs who now would not leave the bones. Men with poles probed pools and pushed through gum shadows where ground gives a little, then takes more. On the third day, a wet hem was found on a briar. On the fourth, a thread from an apron snagged on cane. Rain came on the fifth, slant and grey, and prints dissolved into patternless damp. A proclamation offered coin for information leading to the capture of the cook Dinah, short and steady, left forearm scarred by hearthwork, and named penalties for those who harbored runaways touched by incendiary intent. No one presented her. The institutional aftermath spread wider than the ashes. Hands from Dogwood Bend were parceled to neighbors under temporary bonds, cabins inspected for tinder, and pots inventoried. A county circular recommended that kitchens be brought closer to the main house for supervision and, paradoxically, to reduce fire spread by control of labor. The same circular advised that bells be kept under lock and that pantry keys be worn at all hours. In meetings at river churches that winter, planters agreed, some with practical worry, some with performative resolve, to embargo night gatherings at the quarters and to forbid children from carrying messages between cabins. The court's euphemisms hardened into policy. Minutes from a spring session recorded an act to regulate household fires and the custody of chemical cleansers, lye now counted among substances to be dispensed by white hands only. Drivers were ordered to report any unusual association with machines by kitchen staff. A following summer, a militia muster at the county green ran a drill named Yard Defense, employing buckets, ropes, and a positioning of horses between gin and quarters that maps in the archive show in careful lines. Dinah's afterstory lived in the rumor paths cut by travelers and peddlers. One stream of talk carried her into the canebrakes to a maroon camp that shifted with high water, a place where fishermen left barter at a bend marked by a split cypress. Another path took her downriver along the Tensor country, then east to a Spanish garrison, where a cook of similar bearing was said to have served rice with fish to men in blue, silent and precise. A third version set her inland among free people of color near the Natchez Trace, her name altered to Maiden, and then to Dina May in church tallies. None of these accounts bore signatures or seals. Each had objects to recommend them: a brass ring traded for a sewing needle, a bone needle recognized by a washerwoman, a fig cutting transplanted outside a cabin where no fig had stood before. The sheriff's own ledger noted a final line months later: no recovery, subsequent fires none. The massacre's numerical clarity, 12 white men dead in a single night, gave power to retellings and motive to erasures. Some papers blamed carelessness with lamp oil. Others spoke of African plots, avoiding names to keep fear general. In the quarters, loss and narrow escape bound into a different lesson: that kitchens and ledgers and keys were not neutral, that dogs could be gentled, that a bell could be made to keep silence as well as time. Small rituals changed. Pantry hooks received covers, bell ropes were tied higher, elders taught children to step light where wet earth remembers. Time moved its bureaucratic steps. In the spring of 1812, the county bound out the youngest children from Dogwood Bend to households along the river, the practice called charity, though it served labor. In late summer of that same year, a fresh inventory of the ruined place listed the fig tree as bearing and valued it for cuttings that might be sold. In the early autumn of 1813, militiamen drilled again on yard defense and retired to a meal taken under watch at kitchens, where women worked with new eyes on every hook and hinge. And much later, in October of 2014, the declassified packet reached the reading room in Montgomery, and the torn ledger leaf with its row of crosses lay under glass, where anyone could trace each mark and consider whether they tallied guests or ends. As for Dinah May, the final official word is absence. No body accounted for, no sale record bearing her marks, no advertisement firm enough to pin her to a city sheet. The documents close around the empty place her name leaves. That emptiness does not feel like accident. It reads like choice and like aid received from hands less visible than power imagined. In the archive, a marginal note in a later hand, anonymous and probably from a graduate researcher, offers a sentence that is not a judgment, but an inference. The site's own physics kept the search from seeing what crossed through Cain in the very hour men looked toward flame. Legacy settled, then, not as a monument but as a set of altered habits. Kitchens were watched with suspicion. Pantries were locked by day. Ledgers were guarded as if numbers themselves could hold back weather and will. Songs in the quarters, according to an oral account taken late in the century, shifted verse to verse into warnings dressed as work chants. Children were told to feed dogs well on certain nights. Women kept a second ring of bent wire under a shelf, not to trick a visitor, but to remind themselves that a hook can be fooled. The story returns, finally, to the first symbols that bound it. The bell, rehung on a new rope months after, sounded again across rebuilt sheds and patched fences, its tone flatter, as if ash had weighted the air. The fig tree that shaded the kitchen window thickened through seasons, roots finding water by the ditch where Prince had once run. And in a climate-controlled case in Montgomery, the household ledger leaf rests with its singed edge, the row of crosses still dark, the wax drop hard as a tear. A visitor leaning close can see ash caught in the paper fibers. It looks like a dusting of flour, the sort a steady cook might brush from her hands before lifting a plain pot into the light.